As you're well aware, at least 100 people are dead after 30 deadly tornadoes devastated towns in 8 different states from Kentucky to Arkansas in a supercell thunderstorm that raged for more than 200 miles. Here to discuss is Dr. Michael Mann. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State University. He's the director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. You should know that he received his undergraduate degrees in physics and applied math from the University of California at Berkeley. He has an MS degree in physics from Yale University, a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale. So the man is a big dummy, but it's great to have him back on the program. Dr. Mann, I appreciate your being here.
Thank you, Michael. Always good to be with you.
Sadly, every time there's a major weather event, I think of you, and I want to call you and invite you back on the program to talk about whether we know of any connection to climate change. In this context, you would say what?
Yeah, I would say, it's unfortunate to be in this business because often when we're asked to speak about these connections, we're talking about a tremendous tragedy. And that's what we saw here, probably more than 100 lost lives. And so this is awful. And unfortunately, it is symptomatic of the increasing risk that we're facing from climate change. At the very core of this event was a very warm Gulf of Mexico that produced lots of heat and moisture that funneled into the southern half of the United States, giving us temperatures in the 70s and 80s in December. And all that warm, moist air provides energy. It provides turbulence. It provides the conditions for large thunderstorms. That's part of what's needed. That's one of the ingredients in these tornado outbreaks. The other ingredient, you need spin, you need rotation in the atmosphere. And that happens when that warm, moist air mass comes into contact with the jet stream. The curvature of the jet stream, the changing winds in the jet stream, that puts spin into the system. And you've got the energy, you've got the spin and the rotation. You get these very large tornado outbreaks, 60 storms, nearly 60 storms, I think, over 6 states. These outbreaks are becoming larger. The science shows that. The upper end of the intensity scale, the most intense tornadoes are getting more intense. The data shows that as well. And we're seeing a shift in the region of tornado genesis slightly to the southeast, which means more of these storms in the regions that were hit in this latest event, and more of them in winter in particular.
To someone who is lacking in your expertise and understanding and looks at this and says, well, it's tragic, but it's a 100-year storm. These things have happened before. They'll happen again. It has nothing to do with changes in the climate. You would say what?
I'd say look at the data. Just look at the trends. We have reliable estimates of the intensities of these storms now. We have radar retrievals, other ways of assessing that. Some of the longer term records are very uncertain because they're just human observations and there are changes in the sort of density of observations. We might have missed more storms. So what we do is we look at the interval of time, the past several decades, where we have reliable data. And over that time frame, we see an increase in the intensities and we see these larger and larger outbreaks.
What's a thunderstorm supercell? I use that in setting up your being on the radio today, and I'm not quite sure what it even means.
Yeah, well, a supercell is sort of like what it sounds like. A storm cell would be, a set of storms. A supercell is an extended line of storms that can, span hundreds of miles potentially. And that's what we saw here. The width of this outbreak was hundreds of miles. One of the most damaging and intense tornadoes in that outbreak, the one that hit Mayfield, Kentucky, decimated Mayfield, Kentucky, that persisted for more than 200 miles. And it had radar retrievals that indicated what we call a gate-to-gate wind. Is basically the difference between the winds going in one direction and the winds going in the other direction. So it's how much stress those winds are putting on you, more than 300 miles per hour. So this is, to some extent unprecedented. We haven't seen an event quite like this.
Dr. Mann, the politics of a storm like this, of a series of storms like this, because it was not a single storm, as you've explained. There are Kentucky politicians, Republicans, who say this is a weather situation. This is not a climate change situation. I'm sure you followed the comments that I'm making reference to. What thoughts do you have on the way this becomes so quickly politicized?
Well, it's unfortunate, Michael. As you know, today, science has become very politicized in this hyper-partisan, atmosphere that we find ourselves, where it's politically expedient for politicians who know better to deny the basic science behind COVID-19 and the measures necessary to deal with that crisis, or the basic science behind what is arguably an even greater crisis, ultimately, the climate crisis. And so, these politicians have to take their heads out of the sand and face up to the fact that the people they're supposed to represent are being subject to greater and greater harm, greater and greater danger. They need to represent the people rather than the polluters who too often fund their campaigns.
And it seems more and more that no area of the country is immune, right? This used to be a coastal phenomena, concern over rising sea levels and so forth. But it seems today that there's no part of the country where you're entirely safe from what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In the past, we focused mostly on sea level rise because that's where we were seeing the most obvious impacts of climate change. But over the past 5 years or so, we have seen an emergence of another signal. And we say an emergence, weather, there's a random component to weather, but when you can really start to see the trends, not just in the data, but with your own eyes, the extreme weather events that we've witnessed over the past several years here in the United States and Europe, around the rest of the world, whether it's superstorms or wildfires, heat waves, droughts, floods, we are seeing the signal of climate change now play out in the form of these unprecedented weather extremes, and they're impacting us everywhere. There's no place that is immune from these impacts.
So you're drawing a causal connection between what we've just experienced and carbon emissions. Is that fair to say? And if so, what's to be done about it?
Yeah, overall, we certainly can't say, oh, that tornado right there, that was caused by climate change. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is this is part of a pattern of larger and larger outbreaks, more and more intense tornadoes. And so this is consistent with all that. And we know what fueled it. It was this very warm air over the Gulf of Mexico that has warmed up more than a degree over the past century. So we can connect the dots, even if we can't, attribute every single tornado within that outbreak somehow to climate change. The overall pattern, climate change is clear in that pattern. And what can we do about it? Well, the best case scenario is what we call a new normal. A lot of people are asking, is this a new normal? A new normal is the best case scenario. That's where we prevent this from getting worse, because these impacts are baked in now. We will have to contend with them. We will have to, institute resilience measures and adaptation measures to deal with the increased risk that we now face. But the only way to prevent it from getting even worse is to solve this problem at its core, which is our ongoing burning of fossil fuels and the carbon pollution that's warming our planet.
The Glasgow Climate Summit, which recently took place, I read descriptions of it that said that it was a failure. I don't know if you buy into that assessment. Did anything good come from it?
Yeah, we're often too quick to sort of, put these things into binary categories. Either it was a total success or a total failure. It was neither. It was somewhere in between. Climate advocates didn't get many things that they would have liked to have gotten out of it: a commitment to end all fossil fuel infrastructure, an ending of all subsidies for fossil fuels. We didn't quite get that. But what we did get were new commitments from various countries, including for the first time India. India, for the first time, committed to ultimately bring their carbon emissions to zero. They pledged to do so pretty late in the game, all the way out in 2070. And of course, they're still growing their sort of energy economy. We in the West have sort of already benefited from access to cheap energy. And so we need to convince them that it's in their interest to do so as well. But that is an important commitment. And when you total up all of the commitments that came out of COP26 in Glasgow, it now brings the projected warming below 2 degrees Celsius, or better part of 4 Fahrenheit, for the first time. 2016 headed into the Paris Accord. we were looking at 4 degrees Celsius, that are part of 8 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet. We've basically cut that in half. Those are only commitments, right? So now we need to make sure that countries, make good on those commitments. And here in the United States, of course, we have to pass legislation. The Build Back Better plan is where the climate provisions lie that would allow the Biden administration to meet its obligation to cut our emissions in half. So now the hard work of implementing those pledges comes in and strengthening them, because 2 degrees Celsius is still too much. We want to bring warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, below 3 Fahrenheit, to avoid some of the worst impacts.
You know that some will see futility in this, because even if the United States does what we should be doing, the rest of the planet can't be counted on.
Yeah, this is a central message of my recent book, The New Climate War. It's about sort of the tactics of climate denial evolving now into climate delay, because, fossil fuel interests, those promoting them, can't claim that nothing's happening. We can see it happening. And so they're turning to other tactics, deflection, division, as I talk about in the book. But one of the tactics, ironically, is doom mongering, despair mongering, because it leads us down the very same path of disengagement as outright denial. If we really believe we have no agency in doing anything about this problem, then why do anything? So we have to look out for that, because a lot of people of goodwill, good-hearted people, are falling victim to that framing. And it is pernicious, because the reality is that we can prevent things from getting worse by acting now.
I have to say, I take telephone calls and speak with people for a living, and I've talked about this issue on an ongoing basis for quite some time now. I don't sense the partisan division among callers. I sense more of a recognition from conservatives, people who are calling me from red states, than would have been the case 10 years ago. I think that there's been a sort of a resignation by some that, this really is what we're confronting and something needs to be done about it. It's turned more into a, not do I buy into it, but a cost conversation. How can we afford? And I know the answer is, how could we afford not to? But take the final word and answer those cost concerns.
Yeah. And, Michael, one of the things that I've been disappointed, I really thought that maybe we were starting to form some sort of bipartisan alliance, coalition for climate action. There were some prominent Republicans who came out and said, we've got to stop denying the science. Let's be part of the meaningful conversation about what we do about this problem. And unfortunately, those hopes are sort of, have evaporated with the hyper-partisan sort of atmosphere that's emerged over the last several years. But the economic arguments often come up. And as you said, the bottom line is it's too expensive not to do anything about it. And by the way, the fossil fuel industry is largely automated at this point. There are far more potential jobs in the installation of new clean energy infrastructure. That's the direction we should be going. Otherwise, we're going to get left behind. And we're going to lose out in the great sort of economic race of this century that will determine which countries are most competitive and which are least. Those who act on climate, those who decarbonize their economies and embrace clean, renewable energy infrastructure are the ones who are going to prevail in this next century.
Final comment, and thanks for being so gracious with your time. Elon Musk, Time Person of the Year, electric vehicles. That's all good news as it relates to your area of expertise, right?
Sure. Folks like Elon Musk, they've done a lot of good here with electric vehicles, with battery technology. Sometimes he says wacky things like, nuking Mars, what have you. We have to sort of ignore that sort of stuff and recognize his positive contributions for what they are. He has moved the ball forward, and we should be thankful for that. Industry has to be part of this solution.
Dr. Michael Mann, shame on me for not mentioning at the outset, your most recent book is called The New Climate War: The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. I'll make sure a link to the Amazon connection is in all my social media. And thank you so much for coming back to the program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. It was truly always a pleasure.